All right, let's start out by thanking our sponsors. Today we have no sponsors because no one listens to this podcast, so no one would ever pay us to sponsor anything on here. Let's start for real, though. What did you think of The Bachelorette last night?
I've never seen a single episode of Bachelor.
I will say that, I'm not a fan of Hannah. As the season goes on, I like her less and less. I do like Jed, though, but she's got to get rid of Cam. Like, for real, if he's on 2 more weeks, I'm going to stop watching. No, I'm not going to say that. 3 more weeks, and I'm going to stop
really
watching.
gotten into this.
It's just one of those things. Sometimes you don't have any gas left in the tank, and you got to go home and just turn on The Bachelorette and melt into the couch. Can anyone else not relate with me there?
No.
Really?
No.
All right, Bachelor Nation, we got our work cut out for us. She's like, this is a programming podcast, right?
Loosen up.
Loosen up. Thanks for coming by our professional podcast studio, which we have permanently set up, as you saw in the last 30 minutes that you've been here since we were supposed to start.
It's okay.
Katie, it's awesome to have you on. We've gotten to know you over the last few years in New York. We always have good conversations at EmberConf, at Portland, and at the meetups. And we figured it'd be awesome to bring you on, talk about some of your critical work that you do in the Ember ecosystem, and then maybe talk about TV shows at the end. So that's usually our itinerary for a podcast interview.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about like a million things before this started. We were like, what were we going to talk about? And it's like, oh yeah, Katie does a million things in Ember.
Yeah, I was trying to think like how we would introduce you, and I was like, okay, we could do like Ember Try, could do Ember Observer, we could do like the steering committee. So I feel like you're all over the place and in a good way. I
feel like I'm all over the place too. Maybe not always in a good way, but it's kind of like I kind of go for whatever I have time for. So like Ember Try, Ember Observer, I can do in the middle of the night and when nobody's around, and the steering committee, and like I also do the Ember beta releases. It just somebody needs to do them.
Oh, cool.
So like if I just have time for something, I'll do that.
Nice.
Whatever seems useful.
You wrote the blog post on the call for blog posts.
Yes.
The meta blog post.
The call for blog posts about the roadmap process. So this is the second time we're doing that. So if you followed along last year, what we did is a call for blog posts, and then we give about a month for everybody in the community to write blog posts. It's for anybody who wants to. And the idea is to have kind of a discourse in those blog posts. So blog posts replying to other blog posts, people building upon other ideas to think about what we're going to be working on in the future and what we want to see come to Ember. And then the entire core teams, all of them, will read all these posts, discuss them, and help draft the roadmap RFC. And the roadmap RFC will be posted just like a normal RFC, and discussion will continue on there as well, same as last year. And hopefully, if all goes well, that'll be adopted sometime in July. And I know it seems weird to adopt a 2019 roadmap in July, but I just call it Ember's fiscal year is a little different.
So that's pretty cool. So that means y'all were pretty happy with how it worked last year, because last year was the first time you did this, and you're basically choosing to do it again. Yeah,
I think we were very happy with how it worked. The roadmap for 2018 included an Octane edition. It's not necessarily true that every roadmap will include an edition, but it will include things that we're working towards. And as you see, if you look back at our 2018 roadmap, we've gotten some things done, some things not done, but that's true. We just want to set guidance for what we want to do and what we want the community to focus on. Right. Not necessarily say, oh, we're going to get all this done by this deadline.
Right. It's nice to have kind of, mission statements out that people can refer back to, because I remember a lot of times the roadmap RFC being referred back to as the new Octane features were coming, as EmberConf was approaching, recentering on what the core things we wanted to focus on. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a good way to keep the community focused and not try to chase the newest idea, the next thing.
Right.
But actually finish some stuff.
Right. Do you have any meta commentary on how the blog posts went last time? Like, how were those? How did you all go through them? How did you think about them? Did you already have some idea for where you wanted the focus to be, and those were things that you would give you some new ideas and make you think, oh, okay, that's something, or just kind of using them as a way to get a general sense of kind of where people are at?
They both surprised me and didn't surprise me, I would say personally. They covered all the things I kind of expected to be covered. And in that way, I think that maybe the Ember core teams have done a really good job of leadership, and that they're talking about all the things we've been talking about that we want for a long time. Mm-hmm. A lot of the features in Octane are things that we discussed years ago and have been working towards over a very long time. So they don't just kind of appear out of nowhere. People are like, I want code splitting. I want these things. I want to import from
why hadn't I thought about that? Thank you so much for writing that down on a blog post.
Yeah. But it's good to see people's opinion on them and why they think they want them. So we can kind of, a lot of times you can find that like the core problem people are having that they think is addressed by code splitting could be addressed some other way. And it's just kind of good to see where everybody was standing. Mm-hmm. There was a lot more in-depth analysis of Ember than I expected, like higher quality than I expected. But then there was also a lot less discussion than I expected, because this was based on a Rust process. So the Rust roadmap process, they have a lot of blog posts, at least they did the 1 year that I read all of them for, that were replying to other blog posts, and people are talking to each other across them. So we didn't get a lot of that. But it was the first time, so we'll see how it goes the second time.
Interesting. Didn't auto import come out of the blog posts last year?
That was the single most requested thing.
Yeah, that's huge.
And that's been a game changer for Ember development. That's been amazing.
It's made me very happy, because EmberObserver gets a lot fewer add-ons that are just wrapping some random library.
Totally.
Yeah.
That's cool. So yeah, maybe something will surprise us this year, right? Maybe a bunch of people will be asking about something, and it was kind of like in the middle of the priority stack, and it's like, oh, actually, this is like pretty high yield, pretty low effort, you know?
Exactly. That kind of trade-off. It was easy to see with all the blog posts. So from our perspective, with all the blog posts, very conveniently, a community member kind of gathered them all together last year in a GitHub repo. And then I went through them and tallied up topics for the number of times they were mentioned.
Seems like something the maintainer of EmberObserver would do.
Yeah, well, it was
on their own accord.
It was kind of shepherding that along as well. So like
That's
the steering
great.
committee is to like shepherd this process along. They don't necessarily write the road. We don't necessarily write the roadmap. We're not responsible for the content, but we're responsible to make sure the process happens. So I wrote up all of that, and we tallied up the things, and that's how it was easy to see that Ember importing from NPM was a very big pain point.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah, that's neat.
Is there anything this year that like you're secretly hoping that someone writes about?
Good question. We're live.
No, we're not.
Wait, how does she know that?
I actually don't know that. But just thinking about it, it's like I have things that I want to see fixed. But as you may have seen, like the call for blog posts came out with a few sample posts. Pretty much everything that I'm hoping for personally was already mentioned. Embroider, Ember Data, and maybe a revisiting of the router.
Right. I know Ed mentioned a while ago, like the router could use just some good old-fashioned refactoring. Because we had talked about, it was in the RFC that you wrote, I think, about running the model hook on every page transition. And then Ed, in typical Ed fashion, said, that's like a good idea. You know what else we should do? And then just...
Yeah. So I'm not personally familiar with the router code, and I'm not necessarily the person you want designing it. But I've heard enough other people talk about it, and I know that it does feel awkward compared to if you're trying to use Octane. It feels like a rough edge compared to the fancy new stuff we get in Octane.
Oh, interesting. What specifically do you have in mind, or what are the pain points that you feel like would be good to be addressed, or is it just an overall...
It's just a gut feeling of like as you're trying to use it, it just doesn't feel as nice as the rest of the system. Also interacting with Ember Data, like how you still have to use .get with Ember Data. You just kind of like some of this, you made this one area really clean, and now this other area that was okay looking now looks really dirty. I think about it like cleaning my house. So I cleaned the living room, and now the dining room looks terrible.
Right.
But I thought it was fine before.
Right.
Next time my wife asked me to clean, I think I'm going to use that argument.
The argument is you have to clean everything all at once.
Yeah, that's a high risk gamble, because if you lose that,
hey,
you
but
really
if
lose.
it pays off.
That's cool. I dabbled in Octane around the time of EmberConf, and then my impatience got the best of me, and I figured I would put it off until it's more polished. We want to make some videos, community videos for it and everything, but I know there were still some last bits that were being sanded out. So I'll be interested to see once it has a stamp on it, and then how the router feels. I feel like once it has a stamp on it, having not been really close to all of the feature development, all the iterations that the features have gone through, just starting it fresh. Also from the perspective of like making a video for a beginner, maybe those rough edges will stand out, and I'll be like, okay, yeah, that's like those are the few parts left that need to be polished.
I still say using Octane feels a lot better than it does not using Octane, but it does make those other parts look like rough edges.
Right.
Interesting. If you were starting a new app today, would you jump right into Octane, or you?
Probably not. I'm very conservative.
Okay. Yeah,
we
us
are
too.
too. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is the process like in the steering committee or core team meetings for getting that stamp of approval on Octane?
As I understand it, there'll be an RFC to call Octane done.
Oh, cool.
So the community will get to say that whether that stamp happens.
Nice.
I will say that I think almost all of the features have landed in ember.js at least, but I think at this point we're working on documentation, making sure that's all polished and makes sense, and any fallout in the add-on community or in other areas. So kind of making sure the whole thing is a polished end result.
Nice. That's definitely something I've noticed in the last few Ember releases. Is it feels like there's always a feature that's like, oh, prepping for Octane, getting us closer to Octane, and it's awesome to see that progress and to be able to use it.
Most of the recent ones have kind of been things that kind of fell out as we're using Octane, or as if people have started using Octane, they found a missing part, and so people need to add something. And so you can see all through, if you look at all the RFCs that have been done, there's been some recent RFCs that even went into Octane, even though they weren't in the original plan for Octane.
Like the template component co-location stuff? Things like that
was actually taken that's not part of Octane.
Oh, okay.
But I think one example would be that was a scope creep or discovered later that we needed. We didn't think of it ahead of time. Was angle bracket invocations for link to and input. I
thought you were going to say for nested components, but for
the nested components was also one. That was when module unification was descoped from Octane. We needed to replace something.
Yep.
To make that possible.
I think that's great, by the way. I think it's great. It's like we like the Basecamp guys, talk a lot about like their development process at work and everything, and they always say, they have this saying that we always find ourselves repeating, which is every project or feature has a 6-day version, a 6-week version, and a 6-month version.
Yes.
And it's so true. And it's great to say like, okay, given that we want to ship Octane, it's not like we have a deadline on Octane, which I also think is good, but for them to say, yeah, our ideal would be to have the module unification stuff done, but given that it's descoped, what does like a polished version of this look like today? And having the dot separators on the nested angle brackets is like great. It's like we all know that there's going to be a better world in the future, but just to have a solid answer to not have that 80% done feeling, it's just so nice.
That's exactly the conversations that were happening.
Yeah, it's great. And I also think Yehuda mentioned this in the sample roadmap blog post, where he was talking about how Octane doesn't have like a deadline, and it's because it's like that's a tricky part. I mean, we even find this in our own work or consulting work we do, where it is true you have the 6-week or the 6-month version. At the same time, if you promise a set of features by a deadline, that's like you're signing yourself up for disaster. If you say we have these features and it's going to be done by this date, you can't ever promise both of those things
at all.
So there's this tricky thing where you say, okay, Octane doesn't have a deadline, but we are aggressively going to say what is like the 6-week version of this rather than the 6-month version or 2-year reworking of the something,
And we're also trying to do a better job of, like, in Agile, I would call it done, like saying that, the documentation's done.
Yes.
Everything around it is done as well.
Yes.
Not just, the features are in Ember.js,
Yes.
it's done.
That's great. I've noticed that as well last year, and that's huge.
Yep.
It just brings so much visibility, That's great. Cool. So how long have you been on the steering community? I guess the steering community itself is relatively new.
Yeah, I think we formed it after EmberConf last year, so I've been on there since the beginning.
And what's the purpose of the steering committee?
I would say it's somewhere between like an admin function and a arbitrator, like somebody who can
Final
arbiter
decision
between
maker.
all the different teams.
If there's a conflict, it gets raised to steering.
Yeah.
And then you all get to make a final
to kind
decision.
of not necessarily make the final decision, but definitely mediate the decision and
Right.
to make sure some of these cross-team processes happen, like the roadmap process, making sure EmberConf, everything is organized for EmberConf. I mean, that's mostly Leia, but like just kind of making sure everything's in place for those kind of things.
Right. Cool. Can you give us any like secrets into, I don't know, I'm trying to think what I would want to ask if I could just ask anyone in the steering committee, because we have a member right here. It's like, I'm kind of interested, like what, is there like a 1 to 2 to 3 year strategic vision, that you all talk about? Do you talk at that length or that amount of time where it's like, where do we want to see Ember a year from now or 2 or 3 years from now? And then kind of
I would say that's the roadmap. Like we'll all write post 2,
Mm-hmm.
so we're not necessarily all of us, but most of us will write post 2, and that goes into the roadmap. I think some of the things that were in the roadmap last year were very much steering committee things.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to increase communication. We wanted to
Simplify.
document more processes, improve collaboration between the teams. So a lot of what we're doing now is just documenting things that have been part of Ember for a long time, like the release process and what it means to be a core team member. And a lot of that's being done by Melanie Sumner. And that's just good. As Ember grows, it makes it's harder to get the same culture from what used to be a really small core team years ago to a lot of people now.
Yeah.
I don't even know the number.
Yeah. And every branch of the tree is like getting more complex in and of itself.
Yes.
So it's like fractal complexity. And so it's a very interesting problem to solve, very hard problem to solve, because you don't have the luxury of being at a company, a CEO at the end of the day just says, boom, we're doing this.
Yeah, there's no one person that can really do that.
Yeah.
But I mean, we have a lot of good collaborative processes for decision making. We have RFCs. We have individual teams that have their own processes for making decisions. It's pretty impressive when you consider we don't have a company, so nobody's paying all of these people to work on this.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice. Everybody's just volunteering, and it's similar to growing other volunteer groups I've been involved with.
Interesting. I've never really thought about that, but that sounds like a really good parallel.
Yeah, it is a volunteer group. Nobody
Yeah.
really thinks about that, but essentially that. Same motivations. Like people do it because it's good for their career. People do it because they feel they owe something to the community. There are all sorts of reasons people might volunteer, but it's the same thing as if I was going to like bake things for a bake sale, or I don't know.
Cool.
I'm trying to think of other volunteer organizations I've been involved with.
Yeah. So you do a lot of volunteer work outside of your day job for Ember, for other parts of the open source ecosystem, but between things like Ember Try and Ember Observer, and then also all of this work on the core team, it's a lot of time.
Yeah, it does add up to a lot of time. It's hard to balance sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes on the podcast we've talked about that problem, just the fact that it's something that some people seem to figure out, and some people balance and go in and out of times where it's harder to do that and times where it's easier. And then some people who it's always interesting to think about if there's alternative ways to allocate resources to the effort. Would people who weren't able to swing it be there, and would, you know what I'm saying? Like if the goal that you have the goals you're trying to achieve, and like what are some different ways you can achieve them? And like I think a lot of communities are experimenting with different ways to do that. Gatsby starting out open source and then raising a lot of money and basically starting a company around it. Patreon, but Ember's never really had anything that direct in terms of payment, I guess. I guess it's always been more indirect through a consulting or an advisory thing that happens to also support the open source work.
Or employment.
Or employment.
I know several people have been hired explicitly to add features to Ember.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, yeah, Ember Observer is an unbelievable resource for the community, as is Ember Try. I mean, I remember this. I'm trying to remember what the conversation was, but you were talking about Ember Try, and someone was asking you about how you had started. I forget if it was on a podcast or something, but maybe it was one of your conference talks a few years ago, but you were basically like, I test things, and when I started doing add-on development, there was no way to test them. So I just stopped writing the add-on until I could test it, because I test things and that's how I work. And I was like, that. I just remember that. Like, it was years ago, and I was like, that's so cool. Like,
it sounds like something I would say. But I did end up writing Ember Try because I had come from the Ruby community. And there's a gem called appraisals, which lets you test against different Ruby, or was it Ruby versions or Rails versions? At this point, I can't even remember. So when I was writing an add-on, I wanted to make sure I worked with multiple different Ember versions. And back then it was a time when Ember wasn't maybe as stable, and so you really wanted to test to make sure. But now it's mostly useful for finding out that Ember accidentally broke something.
It's very useful. Yeah, for that.
I can't imagine maintaining an add-on without it. Seriously, I can't. Just the other day, I found out that add-on docs is broken.
Hey, watch yourself.
Shots fired. No, seriously, that's broken in beta, and I just never would have known that.
Yeah.
And it was super easy to trace and see that the consuming add-on, what it was, and open a PR and get it fixed. And
yeah,
it's all Ember Try. Like,
that's
it's
great.
all,
I like to hear it found something for real.
Oh
my gosh.
Absolutely. There's no way I would have found this. I would have found it in 3 months from now with like a user opening a bug report. So yeah, I cannot imagine maintaining an add-on without.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's Ryan's way of saying thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much.
It's a huge compliment, because that's an unbelievable tool. I think it's really cool how you bring, knowledge from your past work, and it's like, this is something I've come to expect. And it makes me think, what other things are out there that someone with a different background who works in Ember or the JavaScript ecosystem would come to expect that we don't have? Because like something like Ember Try would never have even occurred to me, except for after maybe a long time of like fighting the same problem. But just the idea that you can have that, you came into it and just knowing that was like a solution to this problem, and you had enough knowledge and experience, you were able to actually build it. And it just makes me think like, yeah, it's like starting on the next floor,
I had no clue when I started writing Ember Try. I actually based it on a script that Ed Faulkner had in Liquid Fire.
Oh.
And I had never written a single line of node code before I started working on Ember Try.
Oh, cool. Well, that's very cool too. But it's the patterns and the architecture and the experience in your mind. Well, that's also true for add-on docs, by the way.
And that's true for Mirage. You say that about Mirage all the time. Like, you were writing an ORM, and you just like copied Rails.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. What I was saying was true about add-on docs is that it literally came from an Ed Faulkner script.
I feel like a lot of stuff does.
Yeah, that's funny.
So that's how you answer your question of how do we find things from other communities. Just look at what Ed's doing in his projects.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. That's funny. Absolutely. Like, I learned actually more about probably back-end development by setting up tons of sample Rails apps just to get Mirage to replicate the behavior. You know what I mean? And then when I go to, it's funny because I go to actually work on a back-end feature in Rails, and I just know my way around it, even though I never did actually like a ton of back-end Rails development, because I just had to like recreate it basically, But that's cool. And what else was I going to say? The one thing I've noticed recently is like the power of Ember Try with Dependabot or Renovate is amazing, because like Tobias and I were just talking on Discord, because like both of our add-ons at the same time said there was some problem with it was like a version of one of the Broccoli plugins that we relied on, and Robert had just published a version or something. We both had a breakage, but like just to have that at 2 a.m. or whatever, when these guys are working, y'all are up in the middle of the night, and to know that Ember Sci Tailwind, the way it's using this thing, is broken, and this version of Ember, because of the try config automatically running with run, it's like very powerful. It's also like, I just saw Gary Bernhardt tweeting about setting aside like his day or 2 or 3 days, what turned into a week, to upgrade all the NPM dependencies in his project. And since like this is like the opposite of that, I feel like this is like going from waterfall to agile, where it's like you used to release your app every 6 months, and it took down your entire company for a week because basically everyone had to like QA it and deploy. It was a huge. Whereas with agile, true agile, it's like deploys are a non-event. And I feel like that's where dependency management, that's the end state. We still don't really see that clearly, but I feel like we're actually closer than that, where I have like 5 add-ons now, and they just piece by piece are always updating, and it's a non-event. And even in EmberMap's front-end code base, like it's the same thing. You just bit by bit upgrade the dependencies one at a time. And with a tool like Ember Try, it's just such a different experience. Like upgrades are not an issue. They don't take a week of time anymore.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to see if we can like get the statistics out of those somehow. Like if we could see that Dependabot with whatever Broccoli plugin fails across whatever number of add-ons it was opened against.
You get notified or something.
I'm sure there's probably some way to get that out of the GitHub API.
Yep.
Even pre-Dependabot, what we have in Ember Observer is we actually have it running the top 200 add-ons with an Ember Try config of our own every night to run against Canary and against Beta for Ember. So I can see every morning.
Oh, so you can take out like Mirage, and even if Mirage's Ember Try config doesn't have Canary, you can just
I just run them all against Canary and Beta we have them running every night, and so we can see a little dashboard like what percentage failed or errored.
That's great, especially for Canary, because Canary changes nightly. So like my Travis might have run last week and it might be green on Canary, but that might not be true a week from now.
Ember Canary is actually published with each commit.
Oh, okay. So more.
Each master Travis builds. Yeah.
Nice.
Wait, and every time that happens, you run all 200 top add-ons?
No.
Oh,
I run this nightly.
Yeah, nightly.
Too expensive to run it.
Yeah. That's crazy.
That's
so cool.
Yeah, that's super cool. How long does that take? Like.
I have no idea, but it finishes by morning.
Just go to bed.
I think it's only a couple hours.
Cool. Have you found stuff from that? Like
yes.
you
a
wake
few
up.
times. Yeah. The first time I found something, I was very excited. I was like, finally, it found all this. So my husband Phil actually did a lot of work on that to get that to work, and so when it finally found something, we were both very happy. All that work finally paid off for something. It took a while though.
Nice.
Ember doesn't really break very often anymore.
So it was just something in Canary that had rippling effects across many like independent add-ons, so you knew it was a bug or something.
Yeah, definitely. It made like something like 70% of add-ons fail. I have no recollection of what it was, but I remember it being reverted.
That's really amazing.
That's
Imagine you as an add-on developer could find out where your add-on would break in apps before the app developer ever used it. That's basically what you're doing. You're finding out where Ember breaks before add-on developers ever use that version of Ember. That's really amazing.
It also makes me wonder, like, would it make sense to even delegate the responsibility of running these tests off of add-on authors into some sort of centralized, like, your Ember Try config is a responsibility of add-on developers right now, and you have to learn how to do a good job with that in a sense. Like, you need to be smart about which, we have great defaults, right? But you still have to understand, at some point, you as an add-on developer have to look at your Ember Try config and make sure, oh, this matrix is important to cover or whatever. You could imagine that being something that if someone did not take the time to set up Travis correctly to run the versions, and all of a sudden like their thing breaks, and it's very preventable, right? If they had just been running it against beta or release or whatever, they would know. But if they didn't, they wouldn't. It's almost like you could delegate that responsibility. So whatever the best Ember Try config is, you just run all the add-ons against it, and that way, if there's an improvement to that process.
Yes and no. I mean, that add-on that didn't set up Travis, they probably also don't have tests.
Yeah.
So they're not going to catch anything with Ember Try.
Interesting.
So with Ember Observer, we have the manual audit that says whether or not an add-on has tests or not, and whether or not they have a build or not. And so, especially the top 200 add-ons, they almost all have tests.
Yep.
So that's a good subset to run against.
Interesting.
We'll probably expand it to the top 1,000 at some point soon, but
that's so cool. Yeah. You know what this also makes me think is, like, what are the necessary, not sufficient, but necessary conditions needed for all of this to work? And it's like, it goes down a long way. It's like, not only is it meaningful tests, but it's like the Semver stuff too. It's very important, like, as you change things. And we've talked about Semver before, and it's interesting because it's like we like to complain about NPM and all this stuff, but I think Steve Klabnik was just writing about this and saying, like, empirically it actually works much better than a lot of things that we've tried in the past to solve this kind of, it's a fractal problem. It's like, if you think about what's going on, it's just insane. It's like mind-boggling that any of it works.
Yes, it is.
What do you think about NPM and Yarn and things like Yarn resolutions and the problems it tries to solve, and like testing versus Semver, and how those are kind of two different ways to tackle the same issue?
I think Semver is a useful tool. I don't think it can at all replace having tests. Like at all. And pretty much if your add-on doesn't have tests or like, and even beyond ones I'll give you the check for having tests for on Ember Observer, I probably won't use your add-on. Like to me, it might as well not exist. And I'm eventually going to end up having to maintain that add-on myself is what I see.
Interesting.
I don't think having Semver is just a kind of a clue to users about what they can expect when they go to that version. And it's also a clue to tools like Dependabot, right? Because Dependabot and how we specify our versions in NPM in package.json wouldn't work without Semver. So like if you find the rare package that doesn't follow Semver is just incrementing, is up to 0.54 for some reason, you have no clue there. You don't know what it means when it went from 54 to 55. Is that a major change? Is that breaking?
Right.
What happened here? You have no clue. But if you have a package that seems to be following Semver and it's 1.2.1 and 1.2.2 comes out, you're reasonably certain it's probably a patch and it's not going to be a big deal.
So it's like you see it as a high bandwidth way to communicate information about the change.
And that can have tooling around it as well. Yes.
But you don't see it as a replacement for tests.
Absolutely not.
You don't see it as, what about, one thing we talked about was like, what about having something like Dependabot automatically merge things, even if it was, somehow automatic. Elm does this thing where if they break a backwards incompatible change, it's a breaking change. But if it wasn't, you're safe to merge it automatically. So you could imagine configuring Dependabot to automatically merge minor updates. You could even imagine configuring Dependabot, let's say on your app, your host app, to automatically merge major changes if your tests pass.
Yeah, you have to be very confident in your test suite for that, though, right? And you have to be sure that it's a dependency that you have good coverage of. So, for example, if I was working on an app with a lot of charts and graphs, they might not have the best test coverage because those are hard to do, especially if they're Canvas.
Right.
So you might actually need to visually look at it, or you might have something like Percy to look at it visually.
Right.
I personally probably wouldn't ever have Dependabot auto merge anything.
Yeah.
My biggest concern being security. So we've seen in the last year or two, like a number of NPM packages where the author or maintainership was given away or taken over, and a bad version was published. And at the minimum thing you can do is look at the changelog and see who published it. I think Dependabot warns you whether or not it's a new maintainer that published it or not. So that's something. But I want to at least see that PR. I don't want that auto merging.
Yeah. Interesting. What about like Yarn versus NPM and like node modules, and like the fact that we use node modules for like bundled front ends? Do you have any thoughts about the state of things? Do you think it's something to be fixed, or is it something that we've kind of worked around with tooling?
I think we've worked around using node modules to bundle front ends. I personally prefer Yarn.
Yeah.
I tried using NPM again in the last few weeks, and it was just, I was like,
NPM.
what is going on?
Nice.
Yeah.
On the right side of history there.
Yeah, probably, hopefully. But Yarn resolutions, though, I've also had bad experiences with. So like anything that's new, I'm always like I said before, I'm very conservative about these things. I consider every dependency a liability.
Yep.
You can see how I've made Ember Try, I've made Ember Observer. It's all about like making sure these dependencies aren't awful.
Right. Right. What about the GitHub registry thing? Have you read a bunch about that?
I read just a little bit about it. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just proxying through to NPM after, if it's getting your private packages there and proxying through the public ones to NPM, for all I know. Yeah.
Interesting. I still hate NPM and node modules. Throw it all away. Start from scratch. That's always worked out for the best. She's like, you literally represent everything I don't believe about software development. You across the table from me.
Except he's laughing about it. So
that's the
clearly
key.
you
That's
don't.
the key. What do you have any you just have a lot of experience and obviously a lot of understanding about big picture things like infrastructure and how to make all these pieces work together. You've done a lot of app development as well. So you kind of have experience from both sides. Some people go really deep in app development, and I find, even though we've done a lot of app development, it's different if you've worked full time on a app for many, many years and you don't do the kind of open source stuff that, both you and I do. It's a different, you're thinking about kind of abstractions at the application level and it's things like that. But you do, and your consultancy does have a lot of experience doing app development. I'm always curious to ask folks in your position, is there some patterns that you see a lot when you come into an app that's not yours? I know I struck a nerve when I got the sigh. I haven't even finished my question yet.
No, sorry. It's the patterns I see in apps I join. So
yeah, if you were on a stage and you could tell folks one piece of advice, don't abstract too early, or don't use any old dependency, or make sure you write more tests, or things like that.
Well, all of that, and
how much time do you have?
Yeah, all of that. I mean, I've seen some truly bizarre stuff in apps that I've joined. Sometimes it's like, where did you even pick up this idea? Or like, I didn't even know that works.
Yeah.
And then sometimes I'm messaging somebody in the Ember core team and being like, did you know this works? Somebody knows it works and knows why and knows the history, but there's some really weird patterns. I think some of some of it is changed over time with Ember. So like, we used to get a lot of like deep nested components. So where you're passing everything through. I think that's one of the worst offenders I see these days, is that like the same data passed down through 10 deep tree of components, whereas you really should be using contextual components and composing them together, and trying to make reusable bits.
Yep. That's a great example of like one of those intermediate things. It's like there's so much beginner material out there, and when we started EmberMap, part of it was trying to fill that gap, but then you realize it's a hard gap to fill. Because the complexity you have the basic principles, and then you have like that plus your domain, and that's where you hit that intermediate level. And the best way is to like work on an actual app and explain it in an actual app, which is what we try to do. But every time we go to a new consulting project, we're surprised, like, oh, this is this concept applied here, but it's like you don't see it until you see it in the actual code,
Yeah. And some of them can be very hard to explain without a concrete example.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really, really hard to come up with the simple example, especially with what do we call when like prop drilling?
Middleman components.
Yeah, where you just keep passing the props down.
Yep.
It's like all the basic examples of data down are one or two components, so it's fine to pass data down. It's like, but real apps can have 20.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And that's one of those rough edges I see that I'm looking forward to the named blocks for.
Yes.
Is that's one of the few times that I end up passing stuff down that I don't want to be passing down.
Yep. Very excited about that. Definitely reach for that a bunch. It's funny because hasn't it been in like Rails templating layer for a long time? Something like it.
Something like it.
Yeah.
I think they were called. I want to say they were called slots. And that's interesting because in Rails I would have considered using those an anti-pattern. Because you all of a sudden once you get that, it's kind of like having Ember wormhole, and you think you could just send stuff all over the place.
Right. I don't have to think about the hierarchy anymore, or like the instance data.
And so it's really hard to tell where anything came from.
I think Rails has it's like content for, and then you can give it a name, and it's like it's great when you have a template that wants to change the page title, because you can do like content for title. But then it's exactly that.
When you're like take global data.
I'm going to start changing the nav over here, but just one section of it. It can get foot gun.
Yeah, you're like, where is this happening? I have no idea.
Interesting. Those are the things that are harder to see how, like, if there's an abstraction that can actually help, or if this is just like the edge of our knowledge of how to help people, and like programming is hard. So it's like, why shouldn't I do this? Because I've written apps for 6 years and it doesn't feel good. Like there's sometimes almost seems like there's not a better answer than that. It's just like you have enough experience and you can just say, this is when I should reach for a global thing like a service, or this is when I should not mutate things or whatever. But
it's very hard to explain like what the downside is to doing something when it seems so easy in that one PR, doing it for this one little feature, and it's not terrible, and it's only here, and I promise I'll never do this again.
Right.
But this is done, and let's call it done.
Right.
No, you need to do that the normal patterned way, because if you keep doing this all over the code base, it's going to become an unmaintainable mess.
Right. So what's your process with like testing, like whether you're working on your own, you and Michelle, or you're maybe mentoring or pairing with folks, at a client's office?
As much as possible, I test drive. I actually not a big user of unit tests in Ember. In my
Very good
opinion, we're
company.
already at the UI layer, so that's where you should have acceptance tests.
Yeah.
And because of so many things, even with integration tests, integration tests I like for doing edge cases within components, but I think that I still end up repeating a lot of the integration tests in acceptance tests because I want to make sure things are wired up correctly.
Yeah, you're writing those components for the UI.
Especially
So
with
test the
contextual
UI.
components, so it's really like how the things are going to be nested really matters, and you're not really going to test a whole different, like repeat what you have in your template in one integration test just to test that
Right.
assortment
Yeah, the data
of
is coming
contextual
from the
components.
model, let's say, in the route. And it's like, that's the most important part.
You know, it's really awesome to hear you say that. That's been one of like we were talking about anti-patterns and stuff, and that was one of the things, like we opened an app and there were tons of unit tests or component integration tests, and it was like a domain app, not an add-on, but like an actual app. That would always be one of our things, or try to drive more acceptance tests. I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and I made this point, and they were just like, absolutely. So I feel like the UI world is starting to come around to this view.
Yeah.
Finally.
Yeah. I thought, like, every time I start this, like, okay, you should do acceptance tests, I feel like it's going to be like a battle that I have to build up to. And when the person was just like, yeah, totally, that makes sense, I was like, oh, come on.
I think part of it is that a lot of people who do tests have been taught the testing pyramid and
Right.
like, oh, you
Yes.
should have more
Yes.
unit tests. And yes, unit tests are great for localizing failures. And if you have a lot of that like little business logic, yes, write unit tests for those individual functions or those individual things. But you also need the acceptance test to go across the whole thing. And probably at least one or two actual end-to-end tests as well. I usually like to have those to make sure everything's really working.
That's interesting. So that's something where I think we're a little weak in, where we don't have a lot of we don't have a lot of end-to-end tests. I think our testing
Our
sort
end-to-end
of,
test is me buying Ryan a pizza and telling him to stay up all night and make sure everything, or like, stays an hour after and clicks once everything's deployed. That's our process, He likes pizza.
I think if you did that, you'd come into work the next day and I would just be like passed out. Like, yeah, I went to bed at like 9 o'clock last night. Sorry, dude. Anyway, what is your system or your process for doing those end-to-end tests? Like, where do you think about the boundaries and what does your setup look like?
So I definitely only do one or two. It's really just a smoke test to make sure that the front end and the back end are integrated. And it really depends on the client app as well. So they need to have the infrastructure for it, right? So they need to have a server we can run these against. They need to have a way to set the back end in a state that you expect. But even just like a test that just logs in can at least make sure that your JavaScripts are loading. You're
Right.
pointing at the right files or...
Totally. It covers so many things.
Yeah.
That your acceptance test suite doesn't cover.
Yeah, that you're actually talking to a backend. I mean, how many times have you just like, oh yeah, my backend's not configured right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
you
that
have
goes down.
backends at the correct URL. You just make sure there's no exceptions, and that's at least covers most of what I want from them.
That's great.
Nice.
If you had complete control over an app that you ran, let's say, would it be Ember and Rails, let's say?
Probably.
And how would the deploys be set up for that?
Well, I completely control EmberMap and it's Ember and Rails. So
Okay.
it is deploying probably not my ideal way, but like I'm very practical. Like if it's working, I'm not going to touch
Sure.
it. So I think it's Ember CLI deploy rsync or something. We rsync the
disk.
build. Yeah.
So there's one app. There's not like two Heroku apps talking to each other.
No. So EmberObserver, I would go broke if EmberObserver was on Heroku. It has a lot of background jobs. It's on a VPS. So they're both hosted in the same place, the back end and the front end.
VPS for the noob in the room.
Virtual private server.
Can you just walk me through what you mean by like, I'm just thinking, I'm trying to compare it to so we have like EmberMap front end on a Heroku app, EmberMap back end on a Heroku app, and they talk to each other. So what's going on here? I just literally don't understand.
Virtual private server is literally like I have a server, but it's also on a server with a bunch of other people's virtual private servers. So they are virtualized, and then that's running like Ubuntu, or I think it's running Ubuntu. Could be some other Linux flavor. And then I have Nginx set up, and when you go to it, it serves the index.html, which points to the JavaScripts, which are hosted via Nginx again. And that points to uses the API. When it hits the API, if it matches the /API, it forwards it down to Rails, and Rails serves up those responses. There's also a caching layer at Nginx.
And you're responsible for all this, like the OS, the Nginx, the load balancing.
So you're like,
Yeah.
it's like DigitalOcean or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's Linode, but
But it's you're managing it.
Yes.
It's okay. So it's not a managed server like
No.
Heroku. Okay, gotcha. Because it would be expensive.
yes.
I see. Interesting.
We have a lot of backend jobs. We have a lot of data storage because we have all of the add-ons that have GitHub repositories cloned for code search to work. We've got the background Ember try testing that actually runs off on a different server. We just got a lot going on, and it would
There's
be
a lot
very
going on.
expensive. Like
Yeah.
I think I priced just the Postgres instance would be like $1,500 a month or something
Oh,
on
wow.
Heroku, and I'm like, not so much.
Yeah.
This cost me like $40 a month.
I'll manage my own server for that.
And fortunately, my husband helps me. So my
Yeah.
husband Phil is also a programmer.
Nice. Very nice. Speaking of the code search, that's something that I find invaluable, especially with you can do like the file name search. So whenever
Yeah.
I'm doing broccoli stuff, I can do index.js
Yeah.
and then search for something, and that's saved me. How can you like walk us through like how does that work? Like what is a
I can walk through it roughly, but there's actually a really great series of blog posts. Michelle built all of Code Search,
Oh,
and she
cool.
wrote blog posts on our Code.a blog. I think there's 3 or 4 of them about how she built it and then also performance tuning it, and it's really fascinating.
awesome?
We'll
We'll,
definitely
we'll
link
link
to
those.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Code Search, it's using Google Code Search under the hood, which is, I believe it's written in Go. And what that does is it indexes code that you actually have on disk. So we have a job that clones all of the add-ons that we have GitHub repos for every night and then runs the index. I think the index is run every hour. And then when you search on the front end, it queries the index, returns the results, and then
And that's that's a Rails controller method, basically. Like that's a Rails API endpoint.
yes. And once you get those responses, if you click to view usages, it hits the API again to get the little usage, actually opening the file and getting a little bit around it.
Yeah.
And if you do the file filter, that's filters all on top of it because there's actually not a lot of options for Google Code Search.
Oh, so that's like custom Rails code.
Yes.
Oh, very neat. Nice.
That's so cool.
And
Yeah.
how is this what Google Code Search, the indexing tool? Like, is it fast? Does it require like a huge database to store all this?
There's no database, I don't think. I think it's just indexing. Well, I mean, something they're storing the index in something. It's not involved with Postgres at all. So Postgres is the backing for EmberObserver's normal day-to-day stuff, but it's not involved with Code Search. I honestly don't remember how it stores stuff.
Cool.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I feel like Ember Observer could have a spot on the more of a featured spot on the homepage because once you start doing the add-on stuff, it becomes an invaluable tool. But it's also kind of like tribal knowledge a little bit. Oh yeah, just go to Code Search and do this thing, and it doesn't take long to learn how to use it. Once you know it's there and know how to use it, you become like a superhero with this stuff. It's like unbelievable.
You mean Code Search more featured on the homepage of EmberObserver?
Yes, ember.js.com even.
Oh, I think that's planned in the new version.
That'd be awesome. But even on Ember Observer too, because I don't think I knew. I kind of remember the very first time I
It says
found out.
Code
about
Search
it.
in the upper right.
Yeah. But you don't know what that is.
I guess that's true.
You know, I forget. I think someone just told me, "Oh, go to Code Search," and they had to tell me to do that. You know.
Yeah.
But it's unbelievable. It's just unbelievably
It's very useful.
powerful.
I use it a lot.
It's really, really useful.
Yeah.
Michelle deserves all the credit.
That's great.
I think you have to use it to appreciate it because I
Yeah.
remember when it came out, I was like, oh, cool. And then when I used it, it was just
Yeah.
mind blown.
So bringing it back to the end-to-end testing stuff. So let's just take your setup with Ember Observer. Do you have an end-to-end like smoke test like that?
No.
How would you do that if, or in the past, how have you done it?
So if I had something like a staging server, I don't think I'd necessarily want to run it against production. I've used, Rails, I've used Capybara to do it before, but if I wanted to run actually against the server, I'd probably use one of the variants of Selenium or one of the libraries that are on top of Selenium to do so. I don't have it because Ember Observer is really a side project, and so
Right.
it is incredibly neglected. Like only the most important things get done, which is kind of sad. I wish there was more tests, but as long as it's working, right?
I mean, that's something that it's just my mind always goes to like, how could you fund this? How could you, is there a pro version of this? Is there a sponsorship version of this? If, you know, cause it's such a useful tool. Like, so I feel like there's an interesting, maybe conversations to have there. Just, you know, how can you start building an email list for Ember Observer? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's like, yeah, I don't know. It's just interesting.
There's a long ramp up there too, though, from nothing to where it can actually support us, though, where it'd be hard to do. So
Yeah.
it's something that we've considered, but
Yeah.
not really a high priority considering we can work as software developers.
Right. Right. I wonder if there's like a newsletter that's like, you know, some of the interesting stuff you know about, like, you know what the new add-ons are, or what's changing from month to month, and how Ember Observer could be a better tool, like how you get the most out of Ember Observer, you know.
You like personally look at all the add-ons too.
Yeah,
right?
I do.
Yeah, I would like. I think it would be cool if you could.
How would Katie solve this problem?
Yeah, or
which
just
add-ons
like
would she use?
you saw something in add-on and you're like, damn, that's cool.
Yep.
Like just because if you say something like that,
Yep.
I'm listening because
Right.
I know you've seen every add-on.
So the funny thing is when I first see add-ons, usually they're like just published and nothing's there yet, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an idea of what they will become. So I don't really ever want to shine a spotlight on them. People are a work in progress. And then when I see them in like the re-review time, I'm just like breezing through it. So I don't take too close of a look. Sometimes I see some things really awesome, but it's rare now because there's a lot of more mature add-ons.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Octane will unleash another flurry of interesting things. So like last couple months, we've had all these interesting modifier add-ons come out.
Yeah. Yes.
I actually created a whole new category for that.
Oh,
Like
cool.
that's great. That's
Yeah.
great. You know, very cool. What was I going to ask? I had something. Here, delay me for a minute.
Let me try to convince you to charge money for Ember Observer.
There you go.
The thing that I know that I think I might pay for is getting a report of all the add-ons that I'm using
Yeah.
and kind of like
Ooh.
their
Interesting.
stat. I want to see their score
Oh,
or just
that's
like
great. So
their
that
stats. Yeah.
When it comes time to have to upgrade,
It's like I know where the bodies are buried.
Yeah,
I
and
got
you
that
get a
report.
warning ahead of time. Oh,
But-
this dependency you used has gone down, you know, and you're like, okay, I kind of know, like, Google Map is going to be a problem, and so maybe we can, when there's downtime, we can deal with that ahead of time. That's a great idea.
There's something to that, but also you have Dependabot now, though, right? So are you even going to think about upgrading Ember Google Map, or is Dependabot going to say your test pass and it updates it?
But what if they never publish because they've become unmaintained?
That's true. A lot of things.
That's
do
actually the
become
biggest
uncontained.
liability of an app, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing I
Like,
started.
what if I rage quit and Mirage just, you know, stagnated?
well, that's
You'd want to know about that,
There's another
presumably.
thing. There's another thing I've been using, which since auto import, I've been using a lot more NPM libraries, and I find the weekly downloads that NPM publishes to be pretty helpful, especially when I'm like looking at like 3 or 4 different packages that do the same thing.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking about stuff like that, like using just metrics, like, you know, maybe this thing isn't that good, but 100,000 other people are in the same boat as me, so it'll get fixed.
Yeah. Maybe there's something to like.
An automated report based on your package JSON.
Well, maybe paying me to review regular NPM packages.
I think that would be a lot of work.
No, I can't do all of them. I would
Yeah.
have to do them based on a
Based on
package.
yeah. It's very interesting though. Those are some interesting ideas. Give me your package JSON, and you just see a chart with like, here are the most at-risk dependencies of your project. I mean, it kind of goes back to your philosophy, what you were talking about earlier. Like, you treat dependencies as a liability. You see the risk in them. There's security issues. There's upgrade issues. There's compatibility issues. It's like super, super interesting.
Yeah, it could be like new maintainer or like doesn't write tests. I don't need a lot. I want like the hot take of these packages.
If we had a package that hadn't been updated in 9 months, and you'd want to know that.
And it's not necessarily like, I would want to know it. It's not necessarily bad, but I would want to know it.
Totally. Another thing that's interesting is like the upgrade process is like great for new things, because when you upgrade like an Ember app, which you used to have a service for, so you've done it a bunch, you know something new has come around, or you know an existing thing has changed. What you don't know is a add-on you have or a dependency you have that you don't need anymore for some reason, or that's been removed from the core blueprint or something like that. And let's say you had Ember CLI Pretender, but now because you have auto import, there's, oh, by the way, you're still using Ember CLI Pretender. You shouldn't. You should get rid of it and just import it like this, and then
right.
that's
So, for example, Pretender would be one of those ones that came from a blueprint from one of your add-ons. So from the core blueprint, I'm pretty sure Ember CLI Update should take care of that. And if it's not, I think that's a bug.
Yeah, the exiting packages. But the biggest thing with apps is third-party dependencies for sure.
Yeah.
That's the biggest pain point at all the consulting projects we had that you have to upgrade. So I think there's definitely some value there. It's pretty interesting.
Right. There's also a number of different ways add-ons can add dependencies to your project, though. They can explicitly add it to your package.json, but they can also
depend on it themselves.
Yeah, or be bringing it in through whatever broccoli tree.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Oh, this would be like putting, like what Ember jQuery does, like putting something in vendor and then app importing it, like that sort of thing?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
But it's very interesting just to think about, show me your package.json, I can tell you the health of your dependency graph. Boom.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting.
One more thing maybe before we wrap up, just to bring it back to the testing thing, I just think it's interesting, folks with your experience, your background, the influences you've had being in the Ruby community, which is very test heavy. And then like we said, we've seen, we kind of, at least I do this, kind of vicariously follow along with the React community and other communities and see where their tastes are. And it did seem to start more with the unit testing stuff, and now there's more emphasis on the end-to-end or the higher level testing. Basically, some of us have been doing an Ember for a while because that's what seems to make sense in the architecture. It's almost like you want a different way to explain. It's almost like the testing pyramid is not really getting at the right thing.
I think the testing pyramid probably is getting at the right thing, but you need to take your app as a whole, as the API and the front end together. And you want to unit test your back end. Mm-hmm. You want to unit test all your business logic. So you do still have more unit tests overall if you're looking across your back end and front end.
It's just that a lot of the units in the front end have tests that you didn't write because you didn't write those units. Is that that's kind of how we think about it, almost where a route invokes its model hook, and that job is done by Ember. So it's not.
Yeah, I don't want to ever test the framework.
Yeah.
So sometimes even if I have a complicated, say computer property or something,
Yep.
I'll extract a function and unit test that function.
Yep.
I don't care about Ember. Ember's going to trigger it on the dependent keys.
Right.
I don't want to test that. And it's probably where the usage of it is probably incidentally getting tested through one of my acceptance
Right.
tests.
Yes.
So
Right.
I don't need to test that it actually computes. I don't want to test the
the
framework.
unit under test or the system under test changes when you think about your app as a whole, as opposed to the computer.
Yeah, if you think of it as a
property
whole, you definitely have more unit tests. You have unit tests in your back end for your model and all your model methods and anything that you have going on there. You probably have also integration tests for your API, maybe even acceptance tests directly on your API. And then in the front end, you have a whole nother set, but it's your front end you're testing. So there should be more, you're more at the acceptance test level.
Right. How do add-ons do overall in the Ember? How would you rate the add-on community or the Ember community when it comes to tests?
Ember community, not as into it as Rails community, I'd say. I don't find as many good test suites in the wild as I would have hoped.
Interesting.
And even in add-ons, a lot of them, I give the point for testing is for having any non-default tests.
Right.
So
low bar.
It's a very low bar, and I would say not very many add-ons have a real comprehensive test suite.
Interesting. Interesting. What do you think the root cause there? Do you think we could use better tooling, better feedback somehow? Do you think it's a philosophy thing based on the Ruby stuff and the Rails stuff? People are talking about it more at conferences. Do you think?
I don't know if it's just philosophy. I don't know if people even realize they should be writing tests in the front end sometimes.
Yeah.
And a lot of add-ons are published. They don't seem to be meant to be reused, a lot of them. They're just publishing them for convenience for use in their company.
Oh, I see.
Oh.
So I think a lot of those don't have test suites. The more popular add-ons end up having test suites, fortunately. So the ones that everybody's using usually
Ember
have a good
concurrency and
good
stuff like
test
that.
suite.
They're going to have a good test suite. Yeah.
And a lot of times you can tell by who the author was.
Yeah.
Like I know whether it's like open up an add-on, I'm like, yep, this will have tests.
Yeah. How do you feel about, sorry, just last question. I'm just so interested. I was just going to ask about like something else we talk about on the podcast, find ourselves talking about a lot is like the front end back end split and like what development is like. And, you know, also having done Rails apps and seeing how productive you are with Rails versus the current stack that you use. You know, what do you love about the current stack that if you were to build a new app tomorrow, like let's just wipe away all your responsibilities and you have to go build an app for someone.
Yeah.
You know, what would you choose the stack? What do you like about that stack? What do you not like about it?
So I'd almost certainly choose Rails and Ember. I'm just the most productive in that. So if I'm just trying to build something, that's what I pick. I've experimented with using Node as a backend. I do have a lot of experience with Node as well, but I find myself more comfortable with Rails. I really like JSON API resources, the backend add-on for API. Ember Observer is using that as well.
Oh, cool.
So I have a lot of experience there with that. And then Ember, like if I try to do a front, like a UI, not in Ember these days, I'm like, I at the very least need Ember CLI. I'm like, I can't do anything without all of my tools in place.
Yeah. I know the feeling.
Yeah. Cool. I tried to do a new version of our website for the consulting company and for Code All Day, and I was trying to do it without Ember, and I'm like, forget it. I'm just going to use Ember, and I'll use, the auto pre-generating thing. Ember.
Yeah, Ember.
Oh, yeah. Oh, cool. How did that work?
I never finished it. I'm still busy.
Yeah. Yep.
I'll get there eventually.
Yep. I want to add that to like add-on docs.
Yeah.
Because all the add-on docs sites should just be like pre-rendered for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I was just listening to another podcast and they were talking about how as you get more experience, almost like you lose patience. And like when you start off, you're so excited about every new thing. And then you're just like, I don't have time for this. I want to get my work done. And it's like, you're productive. And
I find myself playing with new things, but they're less likely to be new programming languages so much as like new APIs and some of the machine learning tools that Google has put out and just kind of seeing what it can play around with.
Seems like you have a lot of applications for that kind of thing in both things like Ember Observer.
Yeah, I haven't actually gotten to implement any of it yet, but I've been playing with it.
That's cool.
Someday. Or like when we did code search, and Michelle was super excited to work with Google Code Search. And originally we were actually going to write a algorithm to do the code search, but
fortunately
we found Google Code
engineers
Search.
had written it for you. It's a great discovery. Always a great discovery. So what are you most excited about, like whether it's framework, language, something you're working on this year, something Ember's working on this year? What's one of your biggest pain points and one of the things you're most excited about solving?
Well, I don't know if I'm excited about solving. I'm excited for somebody else to solve it.
It's the best. That's also though you're sitting in good company.
That's the most beautiful thing about Ember, right? Like you don't need to be involved in everything. Like there's people working on every possible thing, and it's like a very batteries included community. So like everything just ends up being a really nice experience eventually. I'm excited to see Ember Data kind of update and fit in with Octane and the new object model and not have to use proxies anymore. Yep.
Amen to that.
Yeah, definitely something we can relate to.
I've been a long-term user of Ember Data, and it's definitely served its purpose, but now it's one of those things that feels rough compared to Octane now that you don't have to use .get everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if we were starting a new app today, we would use Ember Data. We've been long-term users of it. I think the data loading and data fetching is so hard, and unfortunately a lot of that just falls on Ember Data, but it just ends up being such a complex problem.
Yeah.
So anything that improves that story, I think is going to pay dividends.
Definitely. That's what I'm excited for.
Cool. Yeah, us too. It'd be nice to see some lower level stuff, which I think is kind of what they're doing, so that the higher level, right now it's all very high level. I mean, to me, that's what I would say, right? Ember Data is very high level in the sense of its APIs and how it tries to help, in the same way that like user.find1 in Rails is trying to abstract so much away from you, right? The database query, hydrating the model, all that stuff. Very high level, nice to work with, but they have the luxury of talking directly to the database, not having like stale data and like a network go out or whatever. Ember Data kind of tries to do the same thing, but it turns out it's so much more complicated. You work on a stateful app and a distributed database basically. So it'd be nice to have like lower level stuff. And then, we've tried to experiment with like what the higher level APIs could look like. But I think if they were to expose the lower level stuff and just let people kind of experiment, we would see some more robust high level APIs.
I'm not even sure about what the exact plans are, but I know there's plans to work on Ember Data, and I think Melanie wrote her roadmap blog post about Ember Data.
Oh, cool.
Nice.
I think I skimmed them all. I have to go back and read that one and look at that.
We should see a lot of more interesting things to be excited about with all the posts coming up.
Yep. That's great. We'll definitely share a link to that too. I think there's like a hashtag that is going to be used to try to gather them.
Yes, EmberJS 2019. Very easy to remember.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much for the conversation and stopping by.
Oh, no problem.
Do you have anything you want to, if folks want to keep up with your work, where should they look? Website, Twitter?
I'm a little quiet on Twitter, but I do tweet new things, so that works. I'm Katie Gengler on Twitter, so it's pretty easy to find. And my website is codeallday.com for our consulting company.
And you run that with just you and Michelle?
Me and Michelle Santisiero.
Great. Awesome. We'll put all links to that in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
All right, Katie, thanks a lot for coming on again. And I'm sure we'll see you at the next meetup.
Yep.
And thanks, y'all, for listening. And we'll see you next week.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.